John stood on the platform, drenched from the unrelenting rain. The small town station was almost deserted, the only sounds coming from the downpour and the distant hum of a flickering light. He glanced at his watch. 12:05 a.m. He was late for the last train of the night, but the station's sign still flickered with the words, "Midnight Special Boarding." He sighed with relief and hurried towards the old, rusting train that had just screeched to a stop. The doors opened with a hiss, releasing a cloud of steam that mingled with the cold night air. There was something unsettling about the train's appearance. The exterior was weathered, almost as if it had been abandoned for years, with grime covering its once shiny surface. John hesitated, a strange unease crawling up his spine, but the thought of missing his ride pushed him forward. He stepped into the train, the dim lights flickering as he entered. The door slammed shut behind him, startling him, and for a brief moment, it felt as though he had been sealed in. The air inside was musty, and the train's interior seemed just as decrepit as the outside dust-covered seats, faded upholstery, and windows so fogged up he couldn't see out of them. There were only a few other passengers, all sitting eerily still, their faces hidden in the shadows. Not wanting to draw attention, John quietly made his way down the narrow aisle and found an empty compartment towards the back. He threw his wet bag on the seat opposite him and collapsed into his own, shivering slightly from the cold that seemed to permeate the train. The train jerked into motion, the wheels clattering against the rails, and the rhythmic sound soon became the only thing he could focus on. As the train picked up speed, John stared out the window, but there was nothing to see, just an endless blanket of fog outside, dense and suffocating. The rain had ceased, but the night was unnaturally dark. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, it was hard to tell. The clock above the door remained frozen at 12, and no announcements came from the conductor. A sudden feeling of isolation gripped him, and he realized that he hadn't seen anyone from the crew, not even a ticket collector. He glanced towards the other passengers again. They hadn't moved an inch. It was as if they were mannequins, perfectly still, their faces hidden behind hats or veils. John felt a cold sweat forming on his brow. He cleared his throat and stood up, deciding to stretch his legs. As he moved down the corridor, something odd caught his eye. The windows, though fogged from the outside, reflected his image back at him with unsettling clarity. But as he looked closer, he noticed something wrong with the reflection. It wasn't his. The figure looking back at him was twisted, its face gaunt and hollow, with eyes sunken deep into its skull. John recoiled in horror, stumbling backward. The reflection followed his movements for a moment before dissolving into a normal, albeit slightly distorted, reflection of himself. Shaken, John hurried down the corridor, trying to shake off the feeling that the train was alive, watching him. He passed by compartment after compartment, each one filled with more passengers, but none of them seemed. They were all deathly still, their faces obscured, their bodies unnaturally stiff. He reached the end of the train, where a single door led into the next carriage. When he tried to open it, it was locked. John banged on the door, feeling his heartbeat quicken. He didn't know why, but he had the sudden urge to get off the train, to escape. Something was terribly wrong. The door didn't budge. "Hey," he called, pounding harder. "Is anyone there?" Silence. John's breath fogged up in the cold air as he leaned his forehead against the door. The train's wheels clacked loudly beneath him, the sound growing more ominous with every second. He turned to go back to his seat, but stopped when he noticed something. One of the passengers had moved. The figure in the compartment nearest him had turned its head just slightly, enough for John to catch a glimpse of its face. His heart stopped. The passenger was no longer wearing a hat or veil. Instead, its face was a decayed, hollow mask, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, and its eyes milky white stared directly at him. John stumbled backward, his blood turning to ice. The figure's grin widened, and it slowly began to rise from its seat, limbs creaking like old wood. As it stood, the other passengers began to move as well, their heads snapping toward him one by one. John's legs moved before his mind could catch up. He sprinted down the corridor, his footsteps echoing through the train. The passengers were following him now, their movements jerky and unnatural, their empty eyes fixed on him with predatory intent. He crashed through compartment doors, frantically trying to find a way out. Each door led to another identical carriage, with more lifeless passengers slowly turning to watch him. The train seemed endless, stretching on, with no end in sight. Panting, John reached the very last carriage, and to his horror, the door here was also locked. He was trapped. The dead passengers closed in around him, their ghastly faces filling his vision. Their whispers filled the air, soft at first but growing louder, a cacophony of voices calling his name, beckoning him to join them. John, you shouldn't have boarded. He pressed himself against the door, eyes wide with terror, as they reached out to him, their bony fingers inches away. Just as one of them grasped his wrist, the door behind him burst open, and John fell backward into the open air. He hit the ground hard, gasping for breath. When he looked up, the train was gone. He was lying on the cold, wet pavement of the station where he had first boarded. The rain had stopped, and the platform was completely empty. John staggered to his feet, his heart still racing. He looked around disoriented. Had it all been a dream, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion? But it had felt so real, too real. He fumbled in his pocket for his phone, hoping to check the time, but something else fell out, an old, yellow ticket. Confused, he picked it up. It wasn't the one he had purchased earlier. This one looked ancient, with faded ink and a worn edge. His blood ran cold as he read the words printed on it. One-way ticket, destination nowhere. The words pulsed in his mind, and from behind him, he heard a low, distant sound, a train whistle. Slowly he turned back toward the tracks. In the fog, he could just make out the outline of a train approaching the platform. But this time there were no lights, no screeching brakes. It was moving in complete silence, like a shadow gliding across the earth. John backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. But as the train came closer, he realized it wasn't just any train, it was the same train, the midnight train, and it had come back for him. The doors opened with a soft hiss, and though the train was empty, John felt its call. The whispers began again, louder this time, echoing inside his head. John. John. It's time. He stumbled backward, but his feet wouldn't move fast enough. The fog closed in around him, thick and suffocating, as the train loomed ever closer. The doors remained open, waiting. And then, just as John turned to flee, he felt cold, skeletal fingers wrap around his wrist. The Explorer. Signing off.